The war sirens had been screaming for 3 days straight. Security Chief Vexitar pressed his 4 hands against his headplates, trying to block out the sound that cut through his skull like hot metal. Around him, the other Chithari security officers were in worse shape. Some had already collapsed, their carapaces clicking against the metal floor as they writhed in pain. The sound was designed to break minds, and it was working. Kepler Station had never been quiet, but this was different. The sirens weren't just loud, they crawled under your skin and stayed there. They made thinking impossible. They made hope die. The hegemony fleet was still 2 days out, but their psychological weapons reached much farther than their guns. Already 3 species had sent surrender messages. The Volani delegation had locked themselves in their quarters and refused to come out. The crystal beings from Xerion had gone completely dark, their bodies dulling to a lifeless gray. Vextar forced himself to keep walking. His job was security, and security meant staying alert even when your brain felt like it was melting. He checked each section of the diplomatic quarter, noting which species were holding up and which ones were breaking down. That's when he noticed something impossible. In Corridor 7 Alpha, the sound changed. Not stopped, changed. The screaming sirens became a dull buzz, then faded to almost nothing. Vextar stopped walking, his compound eyes trying to process what was happening. He could still hear the sirens from the corridors behind and ahead of him, but here, in this 50-meter stretch, they were barely a whisper. At the center of the quiet zone walked a human. Commander Sarah Chen moved at a steady pace, her hands at her sides, her face calm. She wore the simple gray uniform of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. Nothing special about her. Medium height, brown hair pulled back, dark eyes that seemed to notice everything. But around her, the sirens that had been driving entire species insane were almost silent. Vextar followed her, his claws clicking on the deck plates. As he moved closer to the human, the pain in his head eased. The terrible pressure that had been building behind his eyes for days started to fade. When Sarah turned a corner, Vexitar hurried to keep up, desperate to stay in that bubble of peace. Other beings had noticed too. A group of Terran maintenance workers sat near where Sarah had passed, their faces relaxed for the first time in days. A Volani trader poked his head out of a shop looking confused but relieved. Sarah stopped at the observation deck and looked out at the stars. Vextar approached carefully. Humans could be dangerous when cornered, and this one was clearly not normal. "Commander Chen," he said, his translator making his clicking speech into human words. She turned to face him. Up close, he could see she looked tired, but not the bone-deep exhaustion that everyone else carried. "Security Chief Vextar, I wondered when you'd find me." "The sirens," he said, gesturing around them. Even here, standing next to her, he could barely hear the psychological weapons that had been tearing his mind apart for days. "They stop around you." "They don't stop," Sarah said quietly. "I can hear them just fine." "Then how?" "They're just sounds, Chief. Loud, annoying sounds meant to break our will." She looked back out at the stars. They don't fall silent for anyone. Vextar's headplates clicked together in confusion. "But the effect is still there. I'm still hearing every frequency, every psychological trigger they're broadcasting. The fear, the despair, the command to surrender." Sarah's voice stayed level like she was discussing the weather. "I just choose not to listen. That's impossible. These weapons have broken entire fleets. The Cathara used similar technology to conquer half the outer rim." Sarah turned to look at him again. Her dark eyes held something Vextar had never seen before. Not in 3 decades of security work, not in any species he'd encountered. It took him a moment to recognize it. Complete refusal. "The Cathara," she said, and there was something hard in her voice now. "Yes, we've met them before." Before Vextar could ask what she meant, Sarah started walking again. The zone of quiet moved with her, and he found himself hurrying to keep up. Other beings began following too. Anyone who could move. Anyone who could think clearly for the first time in days. They walked through the diplomatic quarter, past the sealed quarters of broken delegations, past security stations where officers lay curled on the floor. Sarah's pace never changed. She nodded to the humans they passed, spoke briefly to a few in their own language, but kept moving. At the central plaza, she finally stopped. The area should have been full of people, but most of the station's population was hiding or had already mentally surrendered. The few beings still moving looked lost, scared, barely holding on to sanity. "Commander," Vextar said. I need to understand what's happening here. My sensors show you're completely baseline human. No cybernetic implants, no genetic modifications, no alien technology. Yet you're doing something that should be impossible. Sarah sat on one of the benches in the plaza. Around her, the zone of quiet spread out like ripples on water. A Villani family emerged from hiding and sat nearby, their children finally able to play without screaming in pain. A group of Terran engineers gathered at a table, their shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. What do you know about human history, Chief? Sarah asked. The basics. Your species developed faster than light travel about 200 years ago. You've been peaceful members of the Galactic Council for over a century. Peaceful, Sarah repeated, and something that might have been a smile crossed her face. Yes, we've been very peaceful lately. What does that mean? It means we learned some hard lessons before we joined the Council. Lessons about what happens when someone tries to break the human spirit. She stood up, and Vexitar noticed that other humans were starting to gather. Maintenance workers, diplomats, traders, civilians. They came from all over the station, moving toward the quiet zone like plants turning toward sunlight. The Sirens affect your people too, Vexitar observed. They look tired, stressed, but not like the other species. We're affected, Sarah agreed. We feel the fear, the despair, the command to surrender. We're not immune to psychological warfare. Then how? We just don't care. Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact. Fear is just a feeling. Despair is just an emotion. Commands are just words. We've learned that you don't have to obey them. Vexitar stared at her. In all his years of security work, dealing with dozens of species, he'd never encountered anything like this. Most beings, when faced with overwhelming psychological pressure, either fought back with technology or surrendered. Humans seem to be doing something else entirely. The hegemony fleet arrives tomorrow, he said. These Sirens are just the beginning. When they get here, they'll broadcast surrender commands directly into our neural pathways. Every species has limits. Sarah looked at him with those dark, uncompromising eyes. We don't, she said simply. And in the growing bubble of silence around them, as more and more beings found relief from the psychological assault, Vextar began to suspect she might be telling the truth. Vextar couldn't sleep. The Sirens had started again at full volume after Sarah left the plaza, and the pain in his head was worse than ever. But that wasn't what kept him awake. It was the questions. He'd run every scan he could think of on Commander Sarah Chen. Medical, psychological, genetic, technological, everything came back normal. Baseline human female, 34 standard years old. No modifications, no implants, no alien DNA. Nothing that should let her walk through psychic warfare like it was background noise. The security footage was even more confusing. For the past 3 days, everywhere Sarah went, the audio sensors picked up a dead zone in the Siren broadcast. It wasn't that the Sirens stopped. They were still transmitting at full power. But something was canceling them out in a perfect sphere around her. Vextar pulled up her personnel file again. Born on Earth, joined the Terran Defense Corps at 18. Served for 12 years before transferring to the Diplomatic Corps. Most of her military record was classified, but he could see she'd served in something called the Silence Wars from 2387 to 2391. He'd never heard of any Silence Wars. A chime at his door interrupted his research. Come in. Dr. Kellnox entered, his crystalline body dim with exhaustion. The xenopsychologist had been one of the few non-humans still able to function, though the Sirens were clearly affecting him badly. I've been analyzing the psychological profiles of species affected by the hegemony weapons, Kellnox said without preamble. His voice came from vibrations in his crystal matrix translated by his collar device. The humans are responding differently than anyone else. How so? Most species show classic signs of psychological warfare breakdown. Fear responses, despair cascades, surrender impulses. But the humans... Kellnox paused, his internal light flickering. They show all the same initial responses. The weapons are affecting them. But then something else happens. Vextar leaned forward. What kind of something else? Resistance patterns I've never seen before. Not technological resistance, their brains aren't blocking the signals. They're receiving every psychological trigger the Sirens broadcast, but instead of breaking down, they seem to actively choose not to respond. That should be impossible. These weapons target basic survival instincts. Exactly. No species should be able to consciously override fear at this level. It's like... Kellnox searched for words. Like they've trained themselves to ignore their own psychology. Vexitar brought up Sarah's file again. Dr. Kelnox, what do you know about something called the Silence Wars? The crystalline being's light flickered faster. I've never heard of them. When did they occur? According to this, 2387 to 2391. 4 years of conflict, but there's no record in the Galactic Council databases. That's impossible. All member species are required to report conflicts. Unless, Vextar said slowly, they weren't a member species when it happened. They looked at each other. Humans had joined the Galactic Council in 2395, just 4 years after Sarah's mysterious war ended. We need to talk to more humans, Kelnox said. An hour later, they sat in conference room 7 with 5 humans. Sarah wasn't among them. She was making rounds through the station, bringing her zone of quiet to areas where beings were breaking down completely. The humans looked tired but functional. Chief Engineer Rodriguez, Diplomatic Attaché Williams, Trade Representative Kumar, Communications Officer Johnson, and Dr. Martinez from the medical bay. All of them had been on the station when the Sirens started, and all of them were coping better than anyone else. We want to understand how you're resisting the psychological warfare, Vextar said. Our scans show the weapons are affecting you, but you're not responding like other species. The humans exchanged glances. It was Rodriguez who spoke first. We've had practice, he said simply. Practice with what? Psychological warfare. Sound weapons, fear broadcasts. All of it. Williams leaned forward. Chief, have you ever heard of the Cathara? Vextar's headplates clicked. Ancient species. Conquered large portions of the Outer Rim using sound-based weapons. They disappeared about 50 years ago. They didn't disappear, Dr. Martinez said quietly. They met us. The room fell silent except for the distant screaming of the sirens. The Cathara found Earth in 2387, Kumar continued. They'd conquered dozens of species using exactly these kinds of weapons. Psychological warfare, fear broadcasts, surrender commands transmitted directly into neural pathways. They expected humans to fold in a few days like everyone else. What happened? Kelnox asked, though his dimming light suggested he was afraid of the answer. We didn't fold, Johnson said. They'd hit us with waves of fear and we'd feel the fear. They'd broadcast despair and we'd feel despair. They'd command us to surrender and we'd hear the command clearly. And then, we'd tell them no. Vexitar stared at them. Just no? Just no, Rodriguez confirmed. See, the Cathara had never encountered a species that could feel fear and still fight. Most beings, when hit with that level of psychological pressure, either surrender or go insane. Humans do something else, which is, we get stubborn. Dr. Martinez pulled up a holographic display. Chief, what you're seeing with Commander Chen isn't unique. Every human on this station is doing the same thing to some degree. We're all hearing the fear, feeling the despair, receiving the surrender commands. We're just choosing not to obey them. But why don't the other humans create the same zone of quiet? The humans looked at each other again. Williams answered, because Sarah was at the Siege of Titan. What happened at the Siege of Titan? The Cathara's final offensive, Kumar said. They surrounded the Titan colony with their entire fleet and broadcast psychological warfare for 6 months straight. Every other species would have broken in hours. The colony held out for 6 months. How many survivors? All of them, Rodriguez said simply. 50,000 humans, including children, held out for 6 months against weapons that had broken entire star systems. When the Terran Defense Corps finally broke through, the colonists were still fighting. Vextar felt something cold in his stomach. 6 months of continuous psychological warfare? Sarah was a Defense Corps lieutenant assigned to the colony when the siege started, Johnson explained. She spent 6 months helping organize resistance, teaching people how to ignore the fear broadcasts, how to function while their own minds were under constant assault. The people who survived Titan, Dr. Martinez added, they're different, not broken, the opposite. They learned to live in psychological warfare like it was natural weather. They can function in conditions that would drive any other species insane. Kelnox's light was barely flickering now, so Commander Chen isn't immune to the sirens. She's mastered them, Williams finished. She spent so long fighting psychological warfare that her presence actually disrupts the weapons. She's not just resisting, she's fighting back. Vextar looked at the humans around the table. They were tired, stressed, clearly affected by the sirens, but they were functional. They were thinking. They were planning. The hegemony fleet arrives in 18 hours, he said. These sirens are just the beginning. We know, Rodriguez said. Sarah's already started organizing resistance groups, teaching other species the techniques we learned during the Silence Wars. You think you can teach non-humans to resist psychological warfare? The humans smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Chief, Kamar said, we taught ourselves to resist it, and we're the species that invented the concept of stubbornness. Outside, the sirens continued their endless scream. But for the first time in days, Vextar thought they might have a chance. The archives were deep in Kepler Station's core, protected by multiple layers of security and shielding. Vextar had clearance to access most files, but what he was looking for had been buried in the deepest classified sections. It had taken him 6 hours to find anything about the Silence Wars, and what he found made his carapace itch with unease. Sarah sat across from him in the archive chamber, the zone of quiet around her making it possible for both of them to think clearly. She'd been reluctant to come, but when Vextar explained what he'd found, her expression had grown dark. You want to know about the Cathara? She said. It wasn't a question. The files are heavily classified, but what I can access... Vextar pulled up a holographic display. The Cathara Empire covered over 200 star systems. They conquered species using what they called the Silent Death, psychological warfare that made resistance impossible. Sarah nodded slowly. They were good at it. They'd had thousands of years to perfect the techniques, sound frequencies that triggered despair, neural commands that felt like your own thoughts telling you to surrender, fear so deep it felt like drowning. According to these records, they conquered 47 different species without firing a single shot. The weapons were completely effective, against everyone but us. Vextar highlighted another section of the file. First contact with Earth, 2387. The Cathara expected the same result they'd gotten everywhere else. Complete surrender within 72 hours. They got a surprise instead. What happened, Sarah? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the classified files floating between them. When she spoke, her voice was distant. I was 19 when they first broadcast to Earth. I was in basic training at the Terran Defense Corps Academy. We were in the middle of a combat exercise when every human on the planet suddenly felt the most intense fear any of us had ever experienced. The holographic display showed casualty reports from that first day. Panic attacks, psychological breakdowns, but surprisingly few fatalities compared to other first contact scenarios. Most of us passed out from the fear, Sarah continued. When we woke up, the Cathara were broadcasting surrender demands. They told us to lay down our weapons, to submit to their rule, to accept that resistance was futile. What did Earth's government do? Sarah's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. They told the Cathara to go to hell. Just like that. Just like that. See, the Cathara made a mistake. They assumed that feeling fear meant we'd obey it. They didn't understand that humans have spent their entire evolutionary history being afraid of things and fighting them anyway. Vextar pulled up tactical reports from the early days of the conflict. The initial phases show massive human casualties. Your fleets were destroyed, your colonies were overrun. We were losing badly, Sarah agreed. The psychological weapons made it almost impossible to coordinate military action. But humans are adaptable. We started developing countermeasures. Technology, psychology. We couldn't block the Cathara weapons, they were too sophisticated. But we could learn to live with them. Military units started training exercises where they had to function while experiencing artificial fear. Colonies practiced daily routines while broadcast despair played through their communication systems. The files showed a gradual shift in the war's pattern. Human forces began lasting longer under psychological assault, then functioning effectively despite it. We learned that fear is just information, Sarah explained. It tells you something might be dangerous. It doesn't tell you what to do about it. The Cathara could make us feel afraid, but they couldn't make us choose surrender over resistance. But the siege of Titan, Sarah's expression hardened. The Cathara's final attempt to break us. They thought if they could prove that humans would eventually surrender under enough pressure, other species would lose hope and join them. Vextar accessed the Titan files. The siege had lasted 180 standard days. The psychological warfare had been constant, intense enough to drive most species permanently insane. 50,000 civilians, he said. Including children, Sarah confirmed. The Cathara thought targeting families would break our will faster. They didn't understand that threatening human children doesn't make us surrender. It makes us fight harder. How did you survive 6 months of that? Sarah stood and walked to the archive chamber's small viewport. Outside, the Sirens continued their assault, but in here they were barely audible. We made it a game, she said quietly. The children, I mean. We taught them that the scary sounds were just noise, and noise couldn't hurt them. We had competitions to see who could ignore the fear broadcast longest. We sang songs louder than the despair commands. That should have been impossible. The psychological warfare was designed to target basic survival instincts. It did target them. We felt every emotion the Cathara tried to force on us, but we also had something they'd never encountered before. Which was? Sarah turned back to him, and in her dark eyes, Vextar saw the same absolute refusal he'd recognized before. Spite. The word hung in the air between them. Spite. Human beings, when pushed hard enough, will fight back just because someone told them not to. The Cathara spent 6 months telling us we were defeated, that resistance was hopeless, that we should surrender for our own good. Sarah's voice grew harder. By the end of the siege, we were fighting them not despite being afraid, but because we were tired of being afraid. What ended it? The Cathara made their final mistake. They broadcast a surrender command so powerful it was meant to override conscious thought completely. Every human on Titan would hear their own mind telling them to give up. Did it work? Sarah's smile was sharp as broken glass. Chief, have you ever tried to tell a human what to think? Vextar realized he was beginning to understand. The command backfired, Sarah continued. Instead of surrendering, 50,000 humans simultaneously got angry at being told what to do by aliens they'd been fighting for 6 months. The psychological backlash overloaded the Cathara's transmission systems. The files showed the aftermath. The Cathara fleet, their primary weapons disabled, had been destroyed by the relief force that had been fighting to reach Titan for months. The war ended after that, Sarah said. The remaining Cathara tried to negotiate, but by then, human ships were hunting them across the galaxy. They sued for peace and retreated to the unknown regions. They haven't been seen since. Vextar studied the woman in front of him. She looked tired, ordinary, completely human. But he was beginning to realize that completely human might be more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The Hegemony fleet, he said. They're using Cathara technology. Upgraded and improved, yes. It's more sophisticated than what we faced during the Silence Wars. Can you stop them? Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the Sirens screamed their message of fear and despair and surrender. Inside their bubble of quiet, she spoke softly. Chief, the Cathara spent 4 years trying to break human will. They used weapons that had conquered dozens of species, commanded fleets that had never known defeat, broadcast fears so deep they felt like dying. And we told them no. The simple words carried the weight of absolute certainty. We told them no, Sarah repeated, and we meant it. The Hegemony thinks they can succeed where the Cathara failed, but they're making the same mistake. They think fear means surrender. They think despair means defeat. She stood to leave, the zone of quiet moving with her. They're about to learn what the Cathara learned. When you try to break the human spirit, she paused at the chamber door. Sometimes it breaks back. The Hegemony fleet dropped out of hyperspace at exactly 0800 station time. Vextar watched from the command center as 200 warships formed an assault formation around Kepler Station. Each ship was massive, bristling with weapons both conventional and psychological. But it was the sound that hit first. The psychological warfare broadcasts from the fleet made the past 3 days of Sirens seem like whispers. The new assault was a wave of pure terror that crashed through the station like a physical force. Vextar's compound eyes went dark as panic flooded his nervous system. Around him, security officers collapsed. Some began screaming. Others simply curled into balls on the floor. Through his personal communicator, he could hear reports from across the station. The Volani delegation had surrendered en masse, their entire diplomatic party broadcasting submission codes to the Hegemony fleet. The crystal beings from Zarian had gone completely dark, their bodies now dull gray rock scattered through their quarters. 3 more species were sending surrender messages every few minutes, but in the middle of the chaos, there was still that impossible zone of quiet. Sarah's voice came over the station-wide communication system, cutting through the psychological static like a blade. Her words were calm, clear, completely unaffected by the fear broadcasts washing over them. All personnel, this is Commander Chen. I need everyone who can still think to listen carefully. What you're feeling right now, the fear, the despair, the voice in your head telling you to surrender, those are weapons. They're not real emotions. They're not your thoughts. They're just sounds designed to make you quit. Vextar forced himself to focus on her voice. Somehow, hearing a human speak with such certainty made it possible to think again. I'm going to teach you what we learned during the Silence Wars. Sarah continued. Fear is just information. It tells you something might be dangerous, but it doesn't tell you what to do about it. You get to choose what to do about it. On the security monitors, Vextar could see something incredible happening. Humans throughout the station were moving purposefully, apparently unaffected by psychological warfare that had broken dozens of other species. They gathered in small groups, talking calmly to terrified aliens, demonstrating techniques that seemed impossible. Dr. Martinez in the medical bay was teaching a group of wounded Chitauri how to separate their own thoughts from the broadcast commands. Chief Rodriguez in engineering had assembled a mixed species team that was somehow managing to keep critical systems online despite the psychological assault. Trade Representative Kumar was in the civilian quarters, showing families how to sing songs louder than the despair broadcasts. How are they doing this? Dr. Kellnox asked. The crystalline being's light was dim but steady. He was one of the few non-humans who had learned some resistance techniques over the past few days. They're teaching what humans know instinctively, Vextar realized. That you don't have to obey emotions just because you feel them. The hegemony fleet had moved into bombardment formation. On the tactical display, Vextar could see the massive psychological warfare arrays powering up for another wave. This one would be strong enough to override conscious thought in most species. Commander Chen, he called into his communicator. The next wave will be much stronger. Sarah's response was immediate. I know, I'm in the communication center. Vextar, I need you to do something for me. What? I need you to choose not to surrender. What does that mean? It means when the next wave hits, you're going to feel terror like nothing you've ever experienced. Your instincts will scream at you to submit, to give up, to make the pain stop. Every survival instinct you have will tell you that resistance is hopeless. Vextar's carapace clicked nervously. And then you're going to tell those instincts they're wrong. The second wave hit like a tsunami of fear. Vextar felt his mind crack under the pressure. Terror flooded his nervous system, so intense it felt like dying, despair so deep it made breathing impossible. And underneath it all, a voice that sounded like his own thoughts. Surrender now, end the pain. Resistance is futile, but Sarah's words echoed in his memory. You get to choose what to do about it. Vextar forced his mandibles to move. The words came out as a whisper, then grew stronger. No. The psychological assault didn't stop. The fear was still there, the despair still crushing. But something had changed. He could feel the emotions without obeying them. He could hear the surrender commands without following them. Around the command center, other officers began to stir. A few Chitauri managed to stand. One of the Terran communications specialists was back at her post, coordinating with human teams throughout the station. Status report, Vextar called out, his voice shaky but functional. Engineering is holding, came Rodriguez's voice. We've got mixed species teams keeping life support online. The humans are teaching resistance techniques as fast as they can. Medical bay is functioning, Dr. Martinez added. We're treating panic attacks and psychological shock, but casualties are lower than expected. Civilian quarters reporting. Kumar's voice was strained but steady. We've got about 40% of non-human population still functional. The children are actually doing better than the adults. They're learning the techniques faster. Vextar looked at the tactical display. The hegemony fleet was powering up for another assault, this one even stronger than the last. Commander Chen, he called. They're preparing another wave. I know. Sarah's voice was coming from the communication center now. Vextar, I need you to trust me. Whatever happens next, whatever you hear, remember that humans don't surrender. What are you planning? Something that Cathara learned the hard way. Sometimes when you push humans hard enough, they push back. The third wave from the hegemony fleet was enormous. Vextar felt it building like pressure before a storm. This wasn't just psychological warfare. It was designed to override free will completely. No species should be able to resist it. But as the wave crashed over Kepler Station, something impossible happened. Instead of breaking, the resistance grew stronger. The humans throughout the station didn't just endure the assault, they began actively fighting it. Vextar could feel the psychological pressure wavering, developing dead spots where the human resistance was creating interference. All stations, Sarah's voice came over the communication system, but now it was different. Now it carried the absolute authority of someone who had survived 6 months of the siege of Titan. The hegemony wants us to be afraid. Let's be afraid. They want us to feel despair. Let's feel despair. They want us to hear their surrender commands. Let's hear them clearly. Vextar realized what she was doing. Instead of blocking the psychological warfare, the humans were accepting it completely and choosing to act anyway. But remember, Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the fear broadcasts with surgical precision. Fear is just information. Despair is just an emotion. Commands are just words. And humans don't take orders from people trying to kill them. The effect was immediate. Across the station, beings who had been cowering in terror began to stand up, not because they weren't afraid anymore, but because they chose to stand up despite being afraid. The psychological warfare is losing effectiveness, Dr. Kelnox reported, his crystalline form brightening. The humans are creating interference in the broadcast. On the tactical display, Vextar could see something that made his mandibles click in amazement. The hegemony fleet's psychological warfare arrays were showing system failures. The human resistance wasn't just enduring the assault, it was overloading the weapons. Impossible, he whispered. Sarah's voice came over his personal communicator. Chief, remember what I told you about the siege of Titan? The Cathara's final command backfired. It's about to happen again. The hegemony is about to learn why the Cathara don't fight humans anymore. The fourth wave from the hegemony fleet was massive, designed to break the will of every sentient being on the station. But instead of surrender, it was met by something the psychological warfare systems couldn't process. 50,000 beings who were afraid, despairing, hearing surrender commands clearly, and saying no anyway. The feedback was immediate and catastrophic. Psychological warfare arrays throughout the hegemony fleet began overloading. Ships designed to break mines found their weapons failing against beings who refused to be broken. And in the communications center, Sarah began broadcasting on all frequencies, her voice carrying across space to every ship in the hegemony fleet. This is Commander Sarah Chen of Kepler Station. Your psychological warfare has failed. Your surrender commands are rejected. We're afraid, we're in despair, we can hear every word you're saying. And we're telling you no anyway. Her voice grew harder, carrying the weight of 4 years of war against the Cathara, 6 months of the siege of Titan, and the absolute refusal that defined her species. They don't fall silent for anyone. Sarah's broadcast cut through space like a signal flare, and the response was immediate. Across the hegemony fleet, psychological warfare systems began failing in cascade failures. Ships that had conquered dozens of worlds found their primary weapons overloading against a single space station that refused to surrender. In Kepler Station's communication center, Sarah stood at the primary console, her hands steady on the controls. The zone of quiet around her had expanded to fill the entire room, giving her team the clarity they needed to coordinate the resistance. Around her, beings from a dozen species worked together with focused determination. Their fear transformed from a weapon against them into fuel for their defiance. Fleet-wide communication failures reported across the hegemony formation, Communications Officer Johnson announced. Their psychological warfare arrays are burning out. How is that possible? Dr. Kelnox asked. He'd made it to the communication center and was helping coordinate medical teams throughout the station. Feedback loop, Sarah explained without taking her eyes off the tactical display. Their weapons are designed to break will and induce surrender. When they encounter absolute refusal instead, the systems can't process the response. They overload trying to find a frequency that will work. On the display, more hegemony ships were showing system failures. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. Chief Vextar, she called into her communicator, I need you to prepare for the next phase. What's the next phase? The hegemony is about to try conventional weapons. When their psychological warfare fails, species like this usually resort to brute force. As if summoned by her words, the tactical display lit up with weapon signatures. The hegemony fleet was powering up plasma cannons, missile arrays, and kinetic bombardment systems. Hundreds of weapons aimed at the station. Shields are at 60%, Chief Rodriguez reported from engineering. We can't take sustained bombardment from a fleet that size. Sarah smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded everyone present why humans had won the Silence Wars. We're not going to take bombardment, she said. We're going to do something else. What? Instead of answering, Sarah activated the station-wide communication system. Her voice reached every corner of Kepler Station, every being still capable of listening. All personnel, this is Commander Chen. The hegemony has just made their final mistake. They've resorted to conventional weapons, which means they've admitted their psychological warfare has failed. They've admitted that we can't be broken. Vextar could hear the change in her voice. This wasn't just calm determination anymore. This was the voice of someone who had spent 4 years fighting an enemy that specialized in breaking spirits, and had never been broken. But more importantly, Sarah continued, they've just confirmed something to every species in this sector, every ship monitoring our communications, every planet that's been threatened by hegemony expansion. She paused, and in that pause, Vextar realized what was about to happen. They've confirmed that psychological warfare can be beaten, that surrender commands can be rejected. That fear doesn't have to mean defeat. The communication board lit up. Signals were coming in from across the sector. Planets that had been broadcasting surrender codes were suddenly going silent. Hegemony occupation forces were reporting unexpected resistance. Ship captains who had submitted to psychological warfare were asking their crews a simple question. If a single space station could refuse to surrender, why couldn't they? Status report from the hegemony fleet, Johnson announced, his voice filled with something that might have been awe. They're receiving surrender revocations from 17 different systems. Occupied worlds are declaring independence. Their own crews are starting to resist psychological control protocols. Sarah nodded as if she'd expected this. Fear is contagious, but so is courage. Once people see that resistance is possible, they stop accepting that surrender is inevitable. The tactical display showed the hegemony fleet moving into bombardment formation. But something was wrong. Ships were breaking formation. Some were turning away entirely. Others were broadcasting queries to Kepler Station, asking for details about resistance techniques. Commander, Vextar called from the security center. We're receiving a priority communication from the Terran Defense Corps. Put it through. Admiral Harrison's voice filled the communication center. Commander Chen, this is Fleet Admiral Harrison aboard the TDF Indomitable. We've been monitoring your situation. Admiral, the station is secure, but we're facing imminent bombardment from a hegemony fleet. Negative, Commander. You're not facing bombardment anymore. On the tactical display, new contacts began appearing. Terran Defense Corps ships, dozens of them, dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation around the hegemony fleet. Admiral, Sarah said, and for the first time since the crisis began, there was emotion in her voice. How did you get here so fast? We've been tracking hegemony expansion in this sector for months. When we detected their psychological warfare broadcast 3 days ago, we knew they were targeting Kepler Station. Admiral Harrison's voice carried grim satisfaction. We also knew that if they were using Cathara technology, there was only one person in the galaxy who could stop them. Sarah's hand tightened on the communication console. Sir? The hero of the siege of Titan. The woman who taught 50,000 civilians to resist 6 months of psychological warfare. The officer who turned the tide of the Silence Wars by proving that human will cannot be broken. Around the communication center, beings from dozens of species looked at Sarah with new understanding. This wasn't just a diplomatic attaché who happened to resist psychological warfare. This was a living legend. One of the humans who had fought the most terrible war in recent history and emerged victorious. The hegemony fleet is requesting permission to withdraw, Johnson reported. Multiple ships are broadcasting surrender codes. Denied, Admiral Harrison's voice was sharp. They came here to break spirits and conquer worlds. They're going to learn what happens when you threaten the human way of doing things. Admiral, Sarah said carefully, the psychological warfare has been neutralized. The immediate threat is over. Commander, the immediate threat was never the real problem. The real problem is that the hegemony thinks they can use fear as a weapon against free beings. That stops today. On the tactical display, the TDF fleet began moving into attack formation. But something unexpected happened. Instead of engaging, they began broadcasting. Attention, hegemony fleet. Admiral Harrison's voice went out on all frequencies. You are guilty of psychological warfare against civilian populations. You have attempted to use fear, despair, and forced surrender against beings who have the right to choose their own fate. The broadcast continued, but Sarah noticed it was being transmitted on more than just military frequencies. This was going out system-wide, sector-wide, to every receiver capable of picking up the signal. However, the Admiral continued, you have also just witnessed something important. You have seen that psychological warfare can be resisted, that fear commands can be rejected, that no being, no matter how advanced their weapons, can force surrender upon those who refuse to give up. Vextar realized what was happening. This wasn't just a military confrontation. This was a teaching moment being broadcast across known space. The human species learned this truth during the Silence Wars. Admiral Harrison continued, we learned it at places like the Siege of Titan, where civilians held out for 6 months against weapons designed to break the will of entire populations. We learned it from people like Commander Sarah Chen, who proved that the human spirit cannot be conquered. Sarah was looking at the communication console, but Vexitar could see she was seeing something else. The memory of 6 months under siege, of children learning to sing louder than despair broadcasts, of 50,000 people choosing resistance over surrender every single day. Today, you have learned it too, the Admiral concluded, and now every species listening to this broadcast has learned it. Fear is just information. Despair is just an emotion. Surrender commands are just words, and free beings don't have to obey them. The hegemony fleet began withdrawing, not in defeat, but in something more profound. In the realization that their primary weapon had just become useless across half the galaxy. Commander Chen, Admiral Harrison called privately, request permission to come aboard. I think the galaxy needs to hear the full story of what happened here. Sarah looked around the communication center, at Vextar, who had learned to choose courage over fear, at Dr. Kelnox, who had helped teach resistance to his own species, at the dozens of beings who had discovered they could feel afraid and fight anyway. Permission granted, Admiral. But the story isn't just about what happened here. No, Sarah's voice carried across the communication center, filled with quiet pride. It's about what happens next. Every species that heard today's broadcast now knows that psychological warfare can be beaten. Every world threatened by fear weapons has seen proof that resistance is possible. Every being who thought surrender was inevitable has learned that they get to choose. She looked directly at Vextar as she spoke the final words. They don't fall silent for anyone, and now they never will. Outside, the space around Kepler Station was filled with ships from Du,